Hi everyone and welcome back to the George Collection. I'm Rachel Rightside Blonde. I want to continue with the theme I've been on the last couple episodes, and that is Hillary Clinton, JFK Jr., George, and Donald Trump. Looking at 1999, which I've gone through before, the April 1999 issue in particular, talking about Hillary Clinton and why she won't be senator. Interesting coming from the magazine of your competitor, right? But looking particularly at January of 1999, I think JFK Jr. was absolutely trolling the Clintons at this point, and here's why. On this cover, it says, John Kennedy takes on Clinton's worst enemy, Richard Mellon Scaife. Why would he interview Clinton's worst enemy in 1999 of all years? And not only are the Clintons brought up on this cover, but so is No Name. Is No Name too honest to be president? Interesting that it's all on the same cover, and it just happens to be 1999, the year that things really start kicking off. Before I read that interview, I want to point out on page 48, on the scandal section, it talks about monsters on the mall, and it says, in their march on Washington, Clinton's enemies cried out for impeachment, but behind closed doors, Republicans were getting nervous. It's talking about people not liking the Clintons, the enemies of the Clintons. Why would he put information about the enemies of the Clintons January of 1999? Not to mention the pictures on those pages. At the end of that article it says, but I can't help thinking of a long meeting I once had with a Bob Livingston staffer who tracked the Clinton scandals for the man who is now Speaker. He was preoccupied with the murder of Vince Foster and with Clinton's drug running through Arkansas's Mena Airport. He'd feel right at home on freerepublic.com. Interesting that they brought that up in one article of this magazine. Then if you flip 2 pages, it talks about the George Political Book of Lists. What else is in the George Political Book of Lists? The Clinton body count. Vince Foster, it's all right there. Ever wondered what Chelsea Clinton's Secret Service codename is? Need to know the name of the 3rd vice president? Curious about which president gave the shortest inaugural address? Want to know who's on the Clinton body count? It's all here in the George Political Book of Lists. Okay, that last part wasn't in there, but if they had put it in there, they probably would have sold twice as many books as they did. Just saying. Then you flip the page, and boom. Who's afraid of Richard Mellon Scaife? Well, the Clintons were for some reason. Let's find out why. Here's what John Kennedy wrote. He's the Johnny Appleseed of conservative ideas to come, the head of the anti-Clinton crazies to others. Say what you want about Richard Mellon Scaife, but this much is established about the Pittsburgh philanthropist and publisher. He's given away some $200 million over the past 30 years to diverse institutions, from the National Taxpayers Union to the Hoover Institute, from the Pittsburgh Symphony to the Girl Scouts. In recent years, Scaife's gifts to anti-Clinton groups, Judicial Watch and the Landmark Legal Foundation, for instance, have provoked charges that he is the mastermind behind a vast right-wing conspiracy to undermine the president. I just find it so interesting that this is who JFK Jr. decides to interview in January of 1999. I'm not going to read the entire article. I'm just going to read a couple questions that I find interesting that John asked Richard and read the answers that Richard gave. John said, you were an early supporter of President Nixon. And Richard said, until Watergate. Then I called for his resignation. Then John said, I read somewhere that you said you were disappointed. Richard said, yes, definitely, and I'll never forget that disappointment. It was Christmas 1973. He was still in office. My secretary came in and said, President Nixon is on the phone. And I said, well, I don't want to talk to him. It was kind of sad that I felt that way. And in every biography that you read, I'm the man who gave $1 million to Nixon in '72. John said, do you see any similarities between Presidents Nixon and Clinton? Richard said, first of all, Nixon had a foreign policy, and I don't see one in the Clinton administration. And I think history will prove in the long run that Nixon was a great president because of his foreign policy. John said, right, but what about the issue of character? Richard said, it's a matter of degree, and I think that on the character issue, Nixon wins hands down, and that's not saying much. John said, let's talk about your relationship with Kenneth Starr and Pepperdine University, because there seems to be a lot of confusion about that. Richard said, okay, as I'm sure you've read, I've contributed to Pepperdine going all the way back to 1962. I have never met Ken Starr, never corresponded with him, never did anything with him. I was one of 12 donors, I believe, to contribute $1 million to fund a chair at the School of Public Policy. That and the School of Law were what he was invited to head. And just like everybody else, I read about it in the newspaper. As a quick aside, at one time Pepperdine wanted to name the law school the Richard Milhous Nixon School of Law. But after what happened to Nixon, they wanted to call it the Richard M. Scaife School of Law. And I said, no way, forget that. I was just as happy that didn't happen. John asked, Why do you suppose it has been reported that you were personally involved in encouraging Starr to join Pepperdine University? Richard replies, well, that takes us back to the media and distortion. Look, I was so happy that Starr was leaving the investigation and taking the job at Pepperdine that I headlined it in my own newspaper. I mean, I wasn't hiding anything. I thought it was tremendous. Get the guy out of there. Let's get somebody in there to do something. John said, you genuinely believe there's something out there to find, don't you? And Richard said, I firmly believe there's a lot out there, yes. John asked, such as? Richard said, let's talk about Vincent Foster. I don't know what happened to Vincent Foster, but I do know it didn't happen the way the investigation came out. He was the highest-ranking administration official to die under mysterious circumstances in decades. And what's more, this was the president's best friend. It just doesn't figure. John said, what is served by bringing this up over and over? Here's a man who is the president's friend. He has a family that's still living. Why keep the issue on the front burner? Richard said, that's an excellent question, and I'll give you the answer I gave several years ago. It is the Rosetta Stone to the Clinton administration. Once you solve that one mystery, you'll know everything that's going on or went on. Wow. John said, but how can you make that premise when detailed investigations have concluded that Vincent Foster was a sad man under sad circumstances who was depressed and took his own life? Richard said, well, if you read his doctor's report, he wasn't sad. That, I believe, was a complete fabrication by the Clinton administration. They said, this is the way it's going to be. This is in George magazine. John said, well, that kind of interpretation of the Foster case led to one of the more famous allegations in 1998, which was Hillary Clinton's charge of a vast right-wing conspiracy to undo the Clinton presidency. Does such a conspiracy exist? Richard said, if there is one, I don't know of it. John said, but countless connections have been made among lawyers for Paula Jones and Ken Starr, the Federalist Society and Linda Tripp. Could all these really just be a coincidence? Richard said, what connections? I mean, sure, you can go back to Ken Starr's law firm and say that he represented Big Tobacco and that Big Tobacco gave money to the Republicans, but that's not a conspiracy. Now, is there a vast left-wing conspiracy? I would certainly say yes to that. John said, if there is no collaboration, how do you explain the fact that you have funded a network of organizations, all of which seem to have at least some focus on toppling the Clinton presidency? Richard said, no, Clinton supporters have made it into that. Our foundations have been in business a long time, a lot longer than the Clinton presidency. Again, we're simply presenting ideas that most colleges and universities and television don't promote. John said, when you heard Hillary Clinton use the term vast right-wing conspiracy, were you offended by that? Richard said, I don't think you can print what I thought, and they laughed. John said, well, how do you know Mrs. Clinton was talking specifically about you? She didn't mention any names. Richard said, Mr. Kennedy, when you reach my age, you'll understand. Look, the Clintons put out a 320-page report a year and a half ago, and my name was on every page. Next, they figured they had to blame somebody for Bill Clinton's indiscretions, so Hillary decided it would be this vast right-wing conspiracy. John said, given some of the things that have been said about President Clinton, the right-wing conspiracy comment is rather tame by comparison, wouldn't you say? This is just amazing. Richard said, not if the comments about Clinton were true. John said, haven't you published things in your papers that have proved to be untrue? Are you prepared to say that everything you publish is true? Richard said, no, of course not. John said, so what's the difference? Richard said, my papers serve only the people of Western Pennsylvania. Bill Clinton serves the world. John said, how can you be so thin-skinned when it comes back at you? You've made yourself a fairly high-profile target by virtue of the people in your employ. Doesn't it seem ironic that you would bristle when you are similarly characterized, whether fairly or unfairly? Richard said, but you talk about poor old Bill and Hillary being paranoid. Listen, he can order people done away with at his will. He's got the entire federal government behind him, and I'm just a guy sitting out here. John said, right, a simple little publisher, come on, you command a great deal of resources and a lot of people. Look at you for leadership. You're not exactly Joe Sixpack. Richard said, no, I'm not Joe Sixpack, but only by the accident of birth. In truth, I'm essentially a shy individual. John said, fair enough, but you still have power, so it's hard to believe that this huge inequity exists between your position and the president's. And Richard said, but I'm not elected. John went on to ask more questions and then said, so if you don't personally dislike Clinton, what's your beef? Richard said, I just want the facts. I want the truth to come out about Whitewater and Travelgate and the billings of the Rose Law Firm, whether Mrs. Clinton did anything illegal. I think there's been a massive cover-up about what Bill Clinton's administration has been doing and what he was doing when he was governor of Arkansas. John said, "Do you think you'd feel this way about any Democratic president?" Richard said, "No, I didn't feel that way about Jimmy Carter. I sure wasn't a fan of Carter's, but he certainly wasn't an embarrassment the way Clinton is." John said, "What do you think about the public's obvious apathy with regard to the Clinton scandals? You charge him with everything from perjury to murder, and 2 presidential elections later, he's still in the Oval Office." Richard said, "Yes, but you're forgetting to mention who the candidates were." John said, "Still, do you honestly feel the man is as bad as you paint him?" Richard said, "I got this item on my desk that I got out of a newspaper I never even heard of. It lists the deaths in the Clinton administration. Have you ever seen this list?" John said, "No, I haven't." Richard said, "God, there must be 60 people on there who have died mysteriously, including 8 of Clinton's former bodyguards in helicopter crashes. I mean, there have been very mysterious deaths. I don't want to belabor the death of Ron Brown, but there is the story in which Brown went into the Oval Office and said, 'They're coming after me and I'm not going to take this, and I'm going to take people down with me. So what am I going to do?' And Clinton got up and right out of The Godfather folded his arms and said, 'That's nice.' And a week later, Brown was dead." John said, "You actually believe there's a connection?" Richard said, "Yeah, I do. And the people in the Air Force, whoever took the photographs, pathologists and so forth, questioned the cause of Brown's death. And a great many of the black leaders also questioned it. They were protesting outside the White House. But then Lewinsky came along and swept the whole thing away." John asks more questions, and this is the last question. "I find it interesting that the Democratic elite could never understand why Ronald Reagan was so popular. In the same way, Republicans have a blindness when it comes to Bill Clinton. They just cannot understand why this man continues to be so popular." And Richard said, "Yeah, well, I'll tell you. They thought Ronald Reagan was an actor. Bill Clinton gets the Triple Academy Award for acting. I mean, he's just putting one over on everybody." You guys, this is absolutely insane. John Kennedy interviews Clinton's worst enemy in January of 1999. 2 pages before that article, it talks about the George Political Book of Lists, which has the Clinton body count in it. And then 2 pages later, they talk about the Clinton body count. They talk about Vince Foster. It's insane. And you know that if the Clintons are reading these magazines, which they were watching him like a hawk, I'm sure they weren't happy about it. So if anybody was wondering if John Kennedy was trolling the Clintons in 1999, the answer is a resounding yes. Before I let you all go, I want to give the biggest birthday shout out to our President and Commander-in-Chief, President Donald J. Trump. Happy birthday, sir. I hope you have the best day. You've earned it. I hope you have fun at the parade. And we appreciate everything you're doing for this country and for each of us. Thank you so much for everything. Happy birthday. That does it for this episode of The George Collection. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time.
Of this extraordinary magazine, George, which is a hoot of a magazine. I thought you were a lawyer.
I was.
What happened?
Well, we decided, actually taking a cue from folks like yourself and you around the 1992 election, that there was an opportunity here to change the definition of a political magazine. Certainly the way Americans were accessing information about politics and politicians was changing. Candidates were appearing on late night talk shows, on talk radio, on sitcoms, and there was a kind of a leveling process. And while the rest of media clearly had caught up with that, we felt that political magazines per se hadn't.
Your mother was a hell of an editor at Doubleday.
That's what I hear.
Would she have liked George?
I think she would have.